Are we all going to die? Well, we all will, but I mean, now, all of us, in one big flash? That is a question that many people were asking themselves in the 1950s and 60s, at the height of the Cold War. Would that be then, gasp, the end of history? We'll know soon.
Don't know much about history. Don't know much biology.
When World War II ended in 1945, the United States and the Soviet Union, aka Russia, were actually good friends. They had been fighting together against a common enemy, Nazi Germany, and just earned a major victory. That was May of 1945. In August, they jointly defeated Japan as well. And then by 1946-47, those two countries were now in a bitter conflict. What happened in between? The answer has much to do with the divide over the future of Europe. As World War II ended, a major conference took place in Yalta in southern Russia. Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and Stalin, the dictator of Russia. The agreement at Yalta would be that whether you would be liberated from US and British forces, as was the case in Western Europe, or by the Russian Red Army, as was the case in Eastern Europe, the same rule would apply. You would have a declaration on liberated Europe, meaning that all these countries would then have free and fair elections and they would get to pick a government of their choice. Maybe communist, maybe not, but Poland, Czechoslovakia, France, Italy, they would each get to pick their future. Germany was a different story because Russia and the US were afraid of a Nazi resurgence. So instead, Germany was divided into 4 zones of occupation: Russian, British, American, but also French, even though the French were not invited at Yalta. The capital of Germany, Berlin, would find itself by happenstance within the Russian zone of occupation, and so it too was divided into 4 tiny zones: Russian, French, British, and American. That's kind of a weird arrangement, but it was thought that all these countries would be friendly for the future, and so there would be no problem having some American troops deep within the Russian zone of occupation. That was 1945. By 1946-47, however, all these countries were bitterly divided. What happened in between? Well, as always in history, it's a mix of short-term and long-term causes. On the one hand, you would have countries like France, Britain, the US, based on the premise of free market democracy, free enterprise, small government, divided powers, democratically elected governments, and essential freedoms like freedom of speech, the press, and religion. On the other side, Russia would be a society based on the model of Karl Marx, meaning common ownership of the means of production, an atheist regime, dictatorship of the proletariat, and on every single level, if you compare the two theologies side by side, they disagree on every single thing. So it was kind of bound that ultimately those two regimes would not get along well. As long as they have a common enemy, Germany, they might make a pact with the devil. As soon as Germany disappeared, then they were bound to fight one another. In the short term, the disputes were about the future of Eastern Europe. When the Red Army liberated places like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, they were bound by the Treaty of Yalta to organize free and fair elections. The notion of free and fair elections, however, was pretty alien to the Russian dictator, Stalin. When Americans heard of it, they lost much of the respect that they had for Stalin and started calling him out on that. That was true also of Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Britain, right after World War II, well, until he got voted out of office. A very dedicated anti-communist who in 1946 went to the US, specifically Missouri, the home state of President Harry Truman, and made a famous speech warning Americans and Truman that from Stettin on the Baltic all the way to Trieste on the Adriatic, it's as if an iron curtain had descended across Europe, and Russia was now the enemy. Around the same time, George Forrest Kennan, who was a US diplomat in Moscow, also sent a famous document called the Long Telegram, warning American policymakers that Russia was up to no good and should now be regarded as an enemy. So if it is an enemy, what do? Do you start World War III? Do you send American tanks all the way to Moscow? Nobody exactly had the guts for that as of 1945. People longed for peace. So the policy that was eventually embraced by Harry Truman was one called containment, and that remained the policy of the US throughout the Cold War. Containment rather than rollback. Containment means you want to prevent the Russians from getting any more than they already have. Meaning that if they want to take over West Germany, France, Italy, you will stop them by force if necessary. But you will not try to reclaim areas that are already under Soviet control because that might spark World War III. Containment was based on the notion too that non-military means would be employed. Economic warfare, propaganda, diplomatic support. What that means, for example, is that in 1947, when you have elections in Italy that the communists might win, the CIA would intervene in Italian elections and get the Catholic Church to also intervene to convince people to vote for the Social Democrats or the Christian Democrats. Or you might create an alliance called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in 1949, uniting the French and the Italians and the British, later on the Germans, to the Americans and the Canadians. If one of them ever got attacked, all of them would feel under attack and would all band together to repulse an attack, as a way to say, don't even try to do something, we will deter you by pledging to all band together. One of the early hotspots of the Cold War was Berlin, because it's an important area, the capital of Germany, that happened to be within the Russian zone of occupation. And to Stalin it was unacceptable, so instead he did what was called the Berlin blockade. He prevented any kind of food from getting in to Berlin to feed the millions of people living there in the western part of Berlin. Remember, at that point there is no wall yet. So what would be the solution by Truman? Do you send the tanks into the eastern zone of Germany to try to forcibly bring food into Berlin? Probably not. That will start World War III. Instead, do you let West Berlin go communist? No, that is a violation of containment. The buck has to stop somewhere. You can't let the Russians get something, otherwise they'll come and ask for more. That had been the lesson of appeasement back in the 1930s. So what you do is you send in a Berlin airlift, a bunch of airplanes into the airports of Berlin, bring everything they need, toothpaste, food, coal, to help them survive through the winter of 1948 and 49, which they did. And eventually Stalin admitted his defeat and lifted the blockade. Ultimately, the presence of British and American forces in Berlin created some problems because people living in Eastern Europe that were not pleased with communist rule, if they wanted to flee to the West, could quite easily do so by simply going to Germany, walking to Berlin, cross the invisible border into West Berlin, and then demand some asylum at the local embassy. As a result, quite a few people left from Eastern Europe, which was an embarrassment to the regimes of Stalin and other communists because it was proof that their system was not as superior as they claimed it to be. So in 1961, to prevent their people from fleeing, the communist regime in Eastern Germany decided to build a wall, the famous Berlin Wall, around West Berlin. It's not a violation of containment per se, so John F. Kennedy, the president at the time, kind of let things go. That wall was eventually destroyed by the people of Germany in 1989 in a symbolic moment that brought an end to the Cold War. But we're not there yet. Another major development of the Cold War was the appearance of nuclear bombs. As early as 1945, in the closing months of World War II, the US had developed its own A-bomb and assumed for a long time that he would have a monopoly on that terrible bomb that had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As it happened, the Russians had better scientists than expected and also pretty good spies and knew a lot of stuff that was going on in the American nuclear program. And so as early as 1949, the Russians successfully exploded their own first nuclear bomb. Then the US developed an even more powerful bomb called the H-bomb or hydrogen bomb. I will spare you the physics, but basically instead of splitting a large atom of uranium or plutonium, fission as it's called, you're trying to merge small atoms like say hydrogen in a process called fusion, which creates even more energy, and you create bombs that might be in the megaton range, meaning one bomb is as explosive as 1 million tons of a standard explosive like TNT. Again, the Americans thought that the H-bomb would be their monopoly for a long time. In fact, by 1953, just 1 year later, the Russians also had their H-bomb. And so you have an equilibrium of terror where both sides would have bombs, not just 1 or 10 or 100 or even 1,000, but ultimately more than 10,000 nuclear warheads a pop, enough to destroy the world many, many times over. These would be of the H-bomb variety, 1 megaton or more. The most powerful bomb ever tested was by the Russians, and it was estimated to have a yield of over 50 megatons, 50 million tons of standard explosives. How can a nuclear bomb kill you? Well, let me count the ways. If you're close enough to ground zero, the yield of the bomb is so great that you will be blasted away, just like a regular bomb would. This photo of downtown Hiroshima gives you a sense of the explosive power of a nuclear bomb. And remember that this was a primitive A bomb, not the more powerful H bomb that came into being in the 50s. If you're a bit further away and you survive the blast, then the heat will get you. There are some horrific photos of the severe burns suffered by the victims of Hiroshima. Even more horrific is that photo. The stain on the concrete is a shadow of a person who was burnt by the atomic bomb. A bit further out, radiation may not be strong enough to kill you at once, but if you get enough of a dose, you will contract radiation sickness, meaning that after a few days, burns will appear on your body, you will vomit, lose your hair, and potentially die within days. This is what happened to the crew of the Russian submarine K-19, for example, when some engineers had to fix a leak in the nuclear engine with virtually no protection equipment against radiation. Not even Liam Neeson could save them. Further out still, radiation may persist for decades, leading to increased rates of cancer. That's the case of Chernobyl, for example, where a nuclear accident took place in 1986, and the whole region had to be evacuated semi-permanently. When the United States first tested the powerful H-bomb in the Pacific in 1952, two frightening things happened. First, the blast was so powerful that the island of the Eluga Lab, where the test was conducted, was simply blown away. Also, during a similar test, some Japanese fishermen who were hundreds of miles away reported being showered with strange ashes. Within days, some of them got sick and even died. That was a sad fate for a ship named, ironically, the Lucky Dragon No. 5. What had happened is that radioactive ashes from the blast had risen so high with the heat that they had been carried by high-altitude winds for a long distance until they had cooled down and then fallen back down. So people realized you could die even if you were hundreds of miles away from the target, but suffering from the fallout. The last impact of nuclear bombs is hypothetical. Scientists believe that if thousands of nuclear warheads detonated at once, a cloud of radioactive ashes would encircle the Earth for months, blocking the rays of the sun and plunging the world into darkness. Crop failures would follow, and then famine. We would end like the dinosaurs did 65 million years ago. That is called the nuclear winter. During the Cold War, the US government tried to reassure the public about the risk of nuclear warfare by, among other things, organizing nuclear drills, the same way we have fire drills or tornado drills today. The solution, the kids were told, was to do as a turtle does, duck under your desk and then cover your head. Remember? Duck and cover.
Dum-dum, beetle-dum-dum, beetle-dum-dum, beetle-dum-dum. There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and the turtle was very alert. When danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do. He ducked and covered, ducked and covered. He did what we all must learn to do. You and you and you and you duck and cover.
Be sure and remember what Bert the Turtle just did, friends, because every one of us must remember to do the same thing. That's what this film is all about. Duck and cover.
This is an official civil defense film.
Now you know how to survive a nuclear war. This might be the most useful thing you ever learn on YouTube. Unless, that is, the government lie and ducking under your desk is not enough to survive a nuclear blast. To defend yourself from nuclear bombs turned out to be impossible. Initially, the first bombs were dropped by bombers that can be slow and maybe shot down. By the 1950s and 1960s, ICBMs came into being, intercontinental ballistic missiles, long-range rockets, that in their case would travel at several times the speed of sound and would be impossible to shoot down as they arrive on their target, and would arrive in just half an hour from one continent to the other as opposed to 10 or 15 hours with a traditional bomber. You could still destroy those rockets on the ground before they took off, however, so a third weapon was developed, a nuclear submarine powered by a nuclear reactor, meaning it could stay submerged for months. In that case, even if you did destroy all the enemy bombers and all their nuclear silos on the ground, you would be guaranteed that there would be a response because you could not get all the nuclear submarines. This became known as mutually assured destruction, the certainty that if a war began, we would all die. The world came very close to nuclear war on several occasions, in part because some of the people that were in charge of the nuclear bombs were a bit too keen on using them. They would be called in the US nuclear use theorists, or nuts. A classic example would be the mad general portrayed in the classic Stanley Kubrick comedy, Dr. Strangelove, or another movie from that same period, Fail-Safe, also very good but much more serious. And on several occasions, through happenstance or an actual crisis, the world came close to nuclear war. This was especially true in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where for 13 days the countries of Russia, Cuba, and the US came close to lobbing missiles at one another. We'll have a whole video about Cuba during the Cold War. What's important about the Cold War is that ultimately it was so devastating to have nuclear bombs that war became unsinkable. That became the whole principle of mutual assured destruction. And luckily there were cool heads that prevailed on both the US and the Soviet side, and so you never had a direct confrontation between the two sides, which is why we call it the Cold War. It was never a hot shooting war, which is why we're still alive today. So if you cannot fight each other directly, you can't have a direct victor in a matter of years. And so the Cold War would go on throughout the 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, only dying off when the Soviet Union itself collapsed around 1991. How can you fight then if you can't use a direct conflict against the other side? Well, maybe you could use propaganda wars instead. Maybe found a radio program called Voice of America and then broadcast subversive programs onto the Russian side. Maybe you could have a big exhibit in Moscow where there will be an international fair and you'll showcase to the world all the great achievements of the Soviet Union. The United States actually participated, and the American pavilion was interesting. It was a typical American home, meaning a suburban home, pretty well developed with all the modern appliances and the icebox and all these things that people loved to have in the 50s. As a way to show to the Russians, well, we might not have rockets that are as good as yours, but we have a great consumer market and our people live much better than those under communist rule. Richard Nixon, who was vice president at the time, came to visit, and Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, was there to talk with him. And he got very angry. You Americans are liars. It's not possible that Americans are nylons and washing machines. And Nixon insisted, yes, our Americans truly live in that kind of wealth. How else can you compete? Well, maybe at the Olympics, which became very political during that period. That if you are a water polo player from Hungary and you're angry that the communists from Russia are controlling your country and it's 1956 and there was a riot in Budapest that got put down, well, maybe go to the Olympics in Melbourne and face the Russian water polo team in the final and be pretty bitter and do enough fighting under the water that the pool will be red with blood by the end. Or maybe if it's maybe you have a great hockey match between the American team that was the underdogs and the dominant Russian hockey team. And the Americans won. The miracle on ice. How else can you compete? Well, space became the big area of competition because it would have a dual meaning. On the one hand, it's civilian pursuit. It's showing that your science is better. It's a very peaceful kind of competition. But obviously, rockets can easily be turned into ICBMs. And if you are better in civilian pursuits of space, then you might be better at lobbing rockets at the other side in the event of nuclear war. The first major milestone was who gets to put an artificial satellite. The Russians were the first to achieve that in October 1957 with the famous Sputnik, that little ball with a radio system inside that went around the Earth multiple times, broadcasting a beep, beep, beep. The next big achievement would be to be able to bring an animal into space. And it was another Russian animal, a dog, Laika, carrying a Russian passport, was the first animal into space. Though sadly her oxygen system failed and she passed away there. Next step, let's bring a man into space. Who is going to be? American? Russian? Some other nationality? Well, it was Yuri Gagarin of Russia, April 1961, another first step for the Russians. First woman, Russian. First walk into space, Russian. Ultimately, the big prize would be to know who gets to the moon first. And there you know the answer. 1969, July, Neil Armstrong, that rocket in the back. So altogether, early Russian victories, and then the grand prize in the end to the Americans. This being the internet, I'm pretty sure that in the comment section, some idiot will come in and say, no, we never went to the moon. By the way, the Earth is flat. And I don't know, just don't. Get away. Go to some other channel, watch videos of contrails. The Cold War never saw a direct confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. It does not mean that nobody died. What you have instead are indirect confrontation between the US and a Soviet ally or the Soviet Union and a US ally. A good example would be in Korea, where many Americans died fighting a pro-communist or in Vietnam, where another generation of Americans fought against an ally, the Soviet Union, in North Vietnam. Or conversely, the Russians might go and invade a place that was allied with the US, such as, say, Afghanistan in the 1980s. But you're not going to win the war by taking over Korea or Vietnam or Afghanistan. In the grand scheme of things, it will not tip over the balance of power one way or the other. What eventually led to the Soviet defeat in the Cold War was a lack of freedoms, politically speaking, and also a lack of economic success, which by the 1980s led to much discontent in Russia and Eastern Europe. That eventually led the people to topple the Berlin Wall. These spread to all the countries of Eastern Europe, eventually led to an army coup in Russia in 1991 and the final toppling of the Soviet Union. Not through a US invasion, but instead through a long-term containment policy. So to answer the question we started with, are we all dead now? No, we're not. It does not mean that we're all safe. A lot of these nuclear warheads are still around. The stockpiles are still quite tremendous. So to conclude, how come we ended up not dying in the Cold War? The answer was mutual assured destruction. As long as each side was convinced that the world would end if they started a nuclear war, then they would not start a war. Or as the Strategic Air Command motto would say, peace is our profession. In fact, in the 1980s, there was even an agreement to stop anti-ballistic missiles, meaning any kind of rockets that would stop incoming rockets. The fear was that if either country was convinced that they might get away with a nuclear war, then they might start it. The more vulnerable people were, strangely, the more likely they were not to go through a nuclear war. Still, it does not mean that all the risks are gone. Nowadays, Russia and the United States still have several thousand nuclear warheads a pop. France has some, Britain, China, Israel, and more recently, India, Pakistan, and North Korea. So the greater risk now is more proliferation. The risk that there are so many countries with nuclear bombs that the likelihood that some of them might start a war is greater. Also, there might be some risk of mishaps still, that somebody in a silo somewhere in North Dakota will not pay attention and then start a nuclear war by happenstance. That might be the answer to a much larger question known as the Fermi paradox. Let me explain a bit more. Over the past 20 years, astronomers have discovered the existence of stars that have planetary systems beyond our own star, of course, the Sun. And just about every star, it seems, in our Milky Way has planets around it. And since you have 300 billion stars with a B or so in our Milky Way, and our Milky Way is one of probably 100 billion galaxies around the universe, you're talking trillions of stars and as many planets or more. If there are trillions of planets out there, surely statistically, quite a few of those, maybe 1,000, maybe 1 billion, will have some life on it. And life is probably abundant in the universe, including intelligent life. But then, why have we found no existence of that life? No signal from radio telescopes, no contact from alien life. The answer to that paradox, at least one of the answers that has been offered, is that it takes a long time for life to evolve. In our case of our Earth, about 4 billion years or so before we got complex life, and then about 3 million years for us humans to evolve. As a result, and that's the essence of the Fermi paradox, there's a risk that it takes very, very long time for an intelligent species to get to the point of interplanetary communication, and then gets intelligent enough that they have the means of the destruction, and then might disappear after just 100 or 200 years as we came close to ourselves. So life might be abundant in the universe, but there is a risk that intelligent life might only last for 100 years or so, a blip in the history of the universe. Hopefully, we'll be more intelligent than that.
We'll meet again. Don't know where, don't know when, but I know we'll meet again some sunny day.